I'm Representative Jeanine Nodder, and today on Chattin with Jeanine, I'm joined by former U.S. Senator John Sununu. A Salem native with a background in engineering and high tech, he represented New Hampshire in both the House and the Senate, focusing on fiscal issues, privacy, and bipartisan reforms. He's remained active in business, education, and community service, and now he's running again for the U.S. Senate. Senator Sununu, I'm going to say welcome back to the show because you were on once. I think it was around 2007 or 8.
Great to be back. Yeah,
and
good
I'm
to see
sorry
you.
It's taken so long. Good to see you too. So your background and motivation. You grew up in Salem and graduated from Salem High. How did that New Hampshire upbringing shape your outlook on public service?
Well, I'll tell you, a big impact was my mom. When I was in middle school and in high school, she was on the school board. She became chairman of the Salem School Board. And, you know, New Hampshire, one of the great things about New Hampshire is our commitment to local politics. And, you know, people who serve on a school board, they feel it. You know, those are important decisions. Everyone cares about education. That's a good thing. But, you know, my mom really taught me what public service was about. You know, you've got to be honest. You've got to be direct with people. You have to make tough decisions. But it's important, you know, it's important to serve. So I think that really affected me, you know, at a pretty young age. Obviously, after that, my father ran for governor. He was involved in politics. We worked on campaigns. And I've always believed, you know, from them that it's about public service, right? It's not about just running for office and staying in office as long as you can. It's about bringing something to the party, if you will. You know, what's your background? What's your experience? Are you good at solving problems? Do you know the people you represent? And then just do the best job you can.
Mm-hmm. I'm with the Federation of Republican Women, and one of the first meetings that I presided over, we had honored your mother, and we talked a lot about her years on the school board. That just
and you know, even today, I have great respect for anyone, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. You serve on a school board, you know, you're really putting yourself out there to the town, to the community, and hopefully you're doing it for the right reasons because you care about the kids, the education, the quality of the schools, and great outcomes. And I think that's a great tradition in New Hampshire.
What led you to take the step from engineering and high tech into elected office originally?
So I was working in manufacturing for the company in Manchester, manufacturing electronics, small business, 30 employees, and there was an open house seat. And I said, well, look, what kind of a representative do I want representing me in Washington? You know, Congress then and now, it's filled with lawyers. Nothing wrong with being a lawyer, but we don't need 435 lawyers in the House of Representatives. I had a technical background, engineering, problem solving, manufacturing, small business. And I thought, look, that makes more sense, right? For New Hampshire, for our small business economy, someone who's worked in a small business, hired, trained employees, dealt with healthcare issues, regulatory issues, and tried to grow jobs. And so that's the perspective I brought to my first campaign, to my work in Congress, and then ultimately to my service in the Senate, right? What's right for New Hampshire, for our economy, keeping it an affordable state and a great state to live and work and raise a family.
Mm-hmm. Since leaving Congress, you've worked in high tech, served on corporate boards, and taught at St. Anselm's, and I know where your office is. I remember walking by it. How have these roles shaped your perspective on the challenges facing New Hampshire today?
Well, you mentioned teaching at St. Anselm's. I mean, that was a great experience. I taught U.S. Congress. And it was interesting because, you know, the issues that we were talking about in class, tariffs, the power of the president to hire and fire people in the executive branch, you know, the challenges of doing a budget, balancing the budget, all of those are the same issues that we were reading about in the paper, you know, as the course is being taught. So, you know, it's something that was important to the students there, very rewarding to me, you know, to get energized by their interest, both in history but also in current events.
Mm-hmm. That sounds good. In Washington, you focused heavily on government waste and fiscal discipline. How do you think those issues would be addressed now?
Well, look, anybody who looks at Washington knows it's a mess, dysfunctional. Obviously, a lot of acrimony, a lot of discord. And it's unfortunate to see because they're not really focusing on the big issues, right? Balancing the budget, dealing with fraud and in government waste that you mentioned. We've seen not just small cases of fraud. I mean, billions of dollars in fraud. In California with hospice care, people claiming they had hospice patients when they really didn't. And in Minnesota, billions of dollars.
The Leering Center.
Billions of dollars of fraud in early child care. And look, there are several huge problems here. One is the waste of resources. But the other is the fact that those are resources that might have been used for people that really needed health care or that really needed early intervention in child care. So it's outrageous. I mean, any taxpayer should be frustrated and angry about it. And it just shows how much work there is to be done to control government spending in order to get the budget balance. We can do it. It's not going to happen overnight, but you balance a budget, like we do here in New Hampshire, right? We focus on spending money on the right things and not wasting money on things that are best left, choices that are best left to families or individuals.
Now, when you were in the Senate, you were on Ways and Means? Is that what your
Yeah, it
committee?
was the tax committee, the finance committee, they called it in the Senate, and on the commerce committee. And, you talk about the technical background. On commerce, we focused on business, obviously, economics and technology. Worked a lot on helping to expand the use of wireless technology, broadband, wrote legislation that banned taxes on the internet. And I'm proud of that because it was a bill I wrote, and I was able to get it passed even though we had Democrat control of Senate that year. It was the longest ban on internet access taxes we ever had and paved the way for today where we're protected from taxes on internet access. And I think because of my technical background, Congress should be very careful about intervening in areas of technology where most members don't really have a very good understanding. Obviously, if there are abuses, illegal actions, Congress should regulate and should crack down. But members of Congress don't know where these new and emerging growing technologies are headed. And so, at that time with wireless technology, broadband technology, and music streaming, we were careful. We didn't use heavy-handed Washington knows best regulation. And as a result, America dominates in those industries today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm just going to jump around here a little bit. I know you're on the campaign trail probably every day and going around to all the different towns. And what's the number one question that people are asking you?
Well, there's no number one question, but I think people are focused on the economy and jobs and affordability, right? We need to make sure we keep inflation down and we keep wages growing. Let's remember really what happened. 3-4 years ago, we had record inflation. 9% per year inflation. We hadn't had that since the 1970s. Over 3.5 years, prices went up 20%. And I'm sorry to say, it was under Joe Biden and the Democrats, reckless spending, out of control spending. Prices went up 20%. Wages didn't go up 20%, right? So people lost ground. Now, over the last year and a half, wages have begun to increase higher than inflation. So we're just beginning to get some of that lost ground back. But, we need to focus on healthcare affordability, more competition, cut regulations, tell people what things really cost. We need to focus on energy affordability. a better infrastructure, make it easier to build new transmission, new gas pipelines to serve people with low-cost energy, and stop with the requirements that we buy energy at above market rates. There are states and around the country that do that, and when they do it in the Northeast, part of our region, it hurts all consumers. And housing affordability. We need to ease up on the regulations that restrict where people can buy materials, make it easier to build multifamily homes, use the low-income tax housing credit. All of those will contribute to affordability. So I think those are the issues that people want to talk about. They're the issues I'm talking about. And let's face it, unfortunately, it's not what people are talking about in Washington. And that's what people are, in Washington, they're voting for government shutdowns. And it's a shame. Chris Pappas, who I'll probably be running against in the general election, he has voted for government shutdowns as we have long lines, TSA lines at the airport. He's voted for government shutdowns. We have security issues in Washington. He's voted for government shutdowns, preventing Homeland Security from getting their funding. That's not what people in New Hampshire want to see. They want to see someone who goes to Washington, focus on the right things, solve problems, and that's what I'm committed to do.
Yeah, thank you. All right, economic and cost of living. You've spoken about reducing inflation, making life more affordable. What specific approaches do you believe would make the biggest difference for families here?
Well, for families here, talked about a few of them.
Yeah.
Okay, so in healthcare we can expand a little bit. So price transparency I mentioned, right? Tell us what things really cost. Why is that important? Because you want families and individuals to make the right decisions for their family's health care. So what does it cost in a hospital? What does it cost in an outpatient clinic? What does it cost in a doctor's office? The regulations. Ask any nurse, any doctor, how much time they spend dealing with federal regulations or paperwork. It's not 5% or 10% of their time. It's 20%. And that's cost that everyone has to deal with in the system. We can do far better. Most of these regulations were written 30 years ago, 35 years ago, okay? We need to do a better job of taking advantage of modern technology, security, safety, privacy, and digital records and communications, and cut back on that paperwork. And last thing on healthcare, anyone who wants a health savings account should have access to one. And we don't have that today. We should have that on day one.
So just explain what a health savings account is.
Look, health savings account allows an individual or a family to put funds in a savings account and have it deducted from their taxes and not pay taxes on those funds. And then you can use it for any kind of healthcare related item, whether it's eye care, glasses, dental care, anything that might not be covered under your insurance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. You've taken a strong position on privacy and surveillance issues. How do you see the balance between safety, technology, and personal privacy today?
Well, I think there aren't enough people talking about these issues, and they become even more important as the technology for surveillance and monitoring that the government uses gets more and more sophisticated. Okay, we want our law enforcement to keep us safe. We want our national security infrastructure to have access to the best technology. But when we give the government, when we give law enforcement more tools or more power, we have to make sure that it's balanced with protections for individual rights, constitutional rights, right? Protection from illegal searches, freedom of speech, access to a lawyer, all those things. So this became an issue for me when we reauthorized the Patriot Act. And
just remind us of what the Patriot Act
was. The Patriot Act, after 9/11, the Patriot Act gave lots of new powers to the government to conduct surveillance with the focus, rightly so, on finding any potential terrorist threats at home and around the world. But these were new tools, and And when it came up for reauthorization after 4 or 5 years, I felt we needed to make sure we had protections for individual constitutional rights and individual freedom. So, for example, if you were served with a subpoena to gather information from your business, you should have access to a lawyer. You should be able to tell people that this has happened. And instead they had a gag order that prevented you as an American citizen from talking about the subpoena that you had been issued. In some cases, it prevented you from getting access to a lawyer. In some cases, it enabled the government to get records of schools and libraries with a very, very low standard. So our sense was you should have additional protections to make sure these powers aren't abused. So this was a bipartisan effort, and frankly, this was an issue where I was on the other side of both the president and the Republican leadership because I thought it was important. We fought, we won, we got changes enacted. Frankly, maybe we could have fought even harder, because at the end of the day, over the last 5-10 years, we have seen or have learned that these powers were really abused. They were abused by Democrat administrations, by Republican administrations. The subpoena power that the FBI and federal investigators had were used in ways that they shouldn't have been used. In other words, most everything we were concerned about, we were right. Now, that just makes me more committed to the idea of not being afraid to take a stand. Never be afraid to stand up when you think someone's individual rights, constitutional rights are being threatened.
Mm-hmm. So while you were talking, I was just remembering the time when you were our senator before, and you had a great staff. I do remember I met several of your staffers. It was Kate. Was one of them named Kate?
Kate Sullivan.
And she had a little girl. And
now you're gonna start quizzing me on all my staff. I remember most all of them.
Yeah.
But look. Constituent service, right? Serving the people of New Hampshire is such an important part of the job. It's not the only part of the job, but it's a critical part of the job. And I always said I would have the best constituent service of any member of the delegation. And I think we met that standard. And you don't do it alone. We had great staff, men and women working. We had offices in Dover and in Manchester and in the North Country in Littleton. And they did a great job. So if you were a senior citizen, if you were a veteran, if you were having trouble with a visa or your passport, Social Security benefits, you knew you could reach out to our office, and we would find a way to get you an answer, to get your issue resolved as best as we possibly could.
There was one local guy who lived near one of your offices, and he would call every day. They would answer the phone.
Look, that's part of the job. It's part of the job.
Yeah. And my first time in Washington, D.C. ever was 2008. And Kate, I called her Mother Hen because I just followed her. I didn't know anything. I never rode in a cab before. So it was.
I was lucky to have great staff, but it's something we worked really hard on.
Yeah, that's good. Maybe she'll be available for the next round. So since leaving Congress, you've remained active in education, teaching at St. A's, nonprofits, and business. So what's the nonprofits? Can you tell me a little bit
I served
about
on the board of the American University in Beirut, served on a number of charitable boards. And then in the private sector, I've been a board member at Boston Scientific, a manufacturer of medical devices, pacemakers, defibrillators, stents. It's sort of an incredible, innovative business, which has been really fun to be a part of because they focus on improving patients' lives, doing it, improving safety, improving the speed, improving outcomes, and it's very innovative, right? Mm-hmm. It's always looking at leading edge of technology so that these devices can be less invasive, safer, simpler to either implant or simpler to use.
That's always good. Let's talk a little bit about mental health because there seems to be a lot of that going around. You worked on bipartisan mental health reforms during your Senate tenure. where do you believe progress has been made and what challenges remain?
Sure. So in the Senate, one of the big issues that we worked on with success was mental health parity. So making sure that mental health was treated the same as physical health when it came to coverage and insurance and regulations and such. So mental health parity, something that I certainly believed in, continue to believe in, and we need to ensure and protect. After the Senate, I worked with a group on looking at mental health issues even more broadly, ways to improve mental health outcomes by using things like telehealth, by improving the way CMS, Medicare, looks at mental health issues.
What is CMS?
Center for Medicare Services. So that's
Okay.
Medicare. So looking at the way Medicare looks at mental health. And now, equally important, we need to continue to look at coverage for mental health for our veterans. And that's not just,
PTSD,
both in terms of ensuring that there's coverage and ensuring that, things like alternative medicine, if it's beneficial, is something that they're covered for as well.
So alternative medicine like acupuncture.
Yes, exactly. It could be different kinds of alternate treatments. Absolutely.
Is there a topic that I didn't cover that you want to cover?
Well, that's always a tough question because there's so much going on. Look, I think the key is that what we really need in New Hampshire is someone who's focused on New Hampshire first. And I've said to people, I'll have one job as senator, and that's stand up for New Hampshire every single day. Too many people go to Washington. They go to Washington to get attention on social media. They go to Washington to pick a fight. They run for an office, and they start thinking about running for their next office and not doing the job. And I think that's part of the reason Washington is dysfunctional right now. Part of the reasons that people who look at Washington are frustrated. And I know that I'll go and focus on the right issues, right? Focus on balancing the budget. Focus on keeping our communities here in New Hampshire safe. Focus on giving New Hampshire more power over the funds that come from Washington. So, for example, education or our Medicaid funding. Those funds come with lots of regulations written by somebody in Washington, D.C. Now, do you really think someone in Washington, D.C. understands how to improve education in Merrimack, New Hampshire better than the people of Merrimack, New Hampshire? Of course not. And so anything we can do to give New Hampshire more power and control over those funds for education, for job retraining, right, for the community college system, will make New Hampshire better off. Anything we can do to give the people of New Hampshire more power and control over Medicaid funding, right, to serve the people in New Hampshire, we're going to be better off. And that's part of putting the state first, putting New Hampshire first, and that's something I'll do every day.
I like how during this whole show today you kept the focus on your campaign and what you will do and how you feel about things. And not every candidate does that. So you've earned my vote.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's look, there is a contrast to be made, but I think you start by explaining to people what your strengths are. I think I use the phrase, what do you bring to the party, right? What's your background and your experience, and what are your solutions for the challenges we're dealing with? But there's a contrast to be made. I mean, I talked a little bit about the out-of-control spending that gave us that 9% inflation a few years ago. We don't want to go back to that. We can talk about the borders that were really out of control. Thousands of people crossing the border illegally, constantly. And it was a human tragedy. It was something nobody wanted to see. Again, Democrat, Republican, but we were told nothing could be done about it. Well, that simply wasn't true. We don't want to go back to that kind of instability and government failure. So I think it's important that you put together solutions and a vision for the future. And at the end of the day, that's important because this is a 6-year term, right? The Senate isn't just about the next 1 or 2 years. It's about where's the country headed over the next 6 years? What kind of vision and leadership does New Hampshire want for the next 6 years? And I know that I can provide a voice that gets heard, that's clear, and that people in Washington will respect, and people in New Hampshire will really benefit from.
And I was just going to say, you have the last minute to speak directly to the audience, but you just did. So
Thank you, Jeanine.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for being on the show, and thank you for watching.